Okay, thank you very much. It's good to be here in southern Alberta. Talking about crop production as it relates to beef production. So I'm going to talk about reduced winter feeding costs by extending the grazing season. And most of my information comes from the parkland, and so we'll try and relate it to southern Alberta the best we can. An example of an extended grazing extending the grazing season method would be using your winter cereals like was talked about previously. We did some of that work as it relates to central Alberta in the mid-1990s. But when we're talking about extending the grazing season and using grazing in our grazing systems for cow-calf, I'm going to relate that to what I call a traditional feeding system. And we do that for the sake of simply having something to compare to, because if we don't do that and we don't do something that's consistent, then it's difficult to know where we're at. But the traditional system that I'm talking about probably differs from what's used on most farms, because most farms will use a combination of methods that are suitable for the regions where they are. But in the parkland or many parts of the prairies, the traditional way of managing beef cows is built around the summer pasture. And an expensive part of the process is how you feed winter cows during the winter. So the traditional system was based on conserved forage, baling hay or green feed, maybe putting up silage. Summer pasture lasts from June through until maybe October. Maybe there's 200, 150 days, 125 days of the winter where you have to feed. So our goals in extending the grazing season are kind of built around the premise that it takes about 65 to 70% of the cost of producing a calf that are devoted to feed, pasture, and bedding, and the most expensive part about that is feeding the cows in the winter. So our goals are reducing the winter feeding costs, the actual activity of feeding the cows, reducing the hauling costs, hauling feed from the field or hauling it around to feed, reducing the harvesting costs, and then finally reducing manure costs. And if we can take some or all of those costs away during that winter feeding period, it would substantially reduce the cost of daily feed production, things like the break-even cost of selling calves in the fall. So using our swath grazing system that we worked on at Lacombe since the mid-1990s, we'll illustrate what that does. The summer pasture season stays about the same. Swath grazing may start immediately in the fall. But the process of planting and planting the crop is different in that we're staggering the planting date so that it can be swathed in September, early October. And then that's all you do. The cattle are fed on the swath in the field in the winter using an electric wire rather than feeding every day. So we've been able to take up some of those days of the 200 days, let's say, for example, or the 150 days, a large percentage of them, by grazing outside in the winter. What are people doing on the farm? Well, the research people in the Western Beef Development Center in Saskatchewan conducted a survey. It used to be the Alberta Cow-Calf Audit, but they conducted it prairie-wide, published it in 2014. We have these number of systems that we would call extended grazing systems at the bottom. And the number of respondents to their survey indicated that there were a significant amount of people across the prairies using any one of these practices, all the way from using straw residues in the field, standing corn, bale grazing, or swath grazing. But still, people have not abandoned using conservation methods, and they're using bales in systems. And you might find a mix and match of all of the systems within the same herd. And in fact, you may find more than one, whereas some people will use swath grazing and stockpile grazing, other people will use stockpile grazing and bale grazing, using them in sequence. So we probably have more complex systems used in practice than we let on. We have to evaluate them one at a time, but we're not saying that one is any better than another. But in some years where we have lots of snow, you may find more bale grazing and less swath grazing, and vice versa. Winters like this, stockpile grazing can be used to advantage. So the smart farmer says, what about the difference in cost? Can I use cost to decide what I might do? Well, there's two different kinds of costs, and I'm showing you the total cost and the yardage cost or fixed cost, the non-feed cost. So really, when we look at total costs, we're looking at those costs after harvest used every day in feeding and taking care of the animals and removing manure. The other cost is the cost of production of the feed, which is so many dollars per acre. So we see that in a traditional cost system, and I've taken that cost up to a scale of 100 cows for 100 days. You have 1,000 cows, multiply it times 10. If you have double the grazing days, multiply it times 2. So in a traditional system, at least half the cost is a cost that's spent every day, and it's difficult to get out of that unless you go to an extended grazing practice that you see on the left. And the extent to which the ones they're on my right, I hope they're on your right, the ones that are on the right are cheaper based on either the amount that they've reduced that yardage cost or the amount that they've reduced the cost of feed production or producing the crop in the field. If we can look then, if we know what the cost is, and we showed the cost, and the cost for a traditional system could be anywhere from $15,000 for 100 cows for 100 days to $20,000, depending on current feed prices and the system. So that we look at how much savings can be made for the days at least that we're going into an extended grazing practice. 100 days for 100 cows would save the most for just using residue in the field and the least for bale grazing. When we started doing work on extended grazing practices with the Western Forage Beef Group in the mid-90s at Lacombe, we looked at a number of strategies to reduce the cost of production of the beef cow. And one of the things that we had to center on was the feeding costs during the winter. And at that time, people were starting to use bale grazing, or rather swath grazing, and they had used bale grazing to a certain extent. And we started with barley, and this is a picture of cows more recently grazing triticale in the snow. But we would have been happy if we could get the cows through the winter, having calves, good conception rates, and show that it was economically feasible. But now we've moved beyond that, and we've looked at a number of different things, different methods, each one of them carried out in the field on field-sized paddocks. And we've done things like compare stockpiled perennial forages to swath-grazed oats. We've looked at stocker cattle in the fall, September and October, the economics and feasibility of that. Mostly we've used barley. We've used barley in most of our experiments because it seems to be the standard for swath grazing. But we've compared it to triticale, corn, and a number of different crops, and now we're moving into looking at different varieties. So if this is so much cheaper, extended grazing practices, what might I expect to spend, and what would the relevance of the inputs in these systems be? Well, one thing to keep in mind while I'm going through this is that it may seem that I'm moving you towards spending money, but I really not. What we want to do is to spend less, but we have to. But in the beef industry, we have this desire to cut costs at above everything, and there's nothing wrong with that. But you have to temper the desire to cut the cost to zero with what it takes to attain yield and maximize carrying capacity if we want to reduce the daily feeding cost of the feed. If we have two crops that cost the same to grow, the one that has the higher yield and carrying capacity is probably going to cost the least per kilogram of feed produced or per pound of dry matter produced. What we have here is the total costs and the cost breakdown of the traditional system we talked about versus 3 swath grazing crops, triticale, corn, and barley. You can see that on the left-hand side, the traditional crop, the crop in green is the feed cost based on the cost of production per hectare or per acre. In that system, we have some costs that are greater, but we have processing in the red, and we find that 46 to 50% of producers do process feed in a traditional system, or processed feed uses a lot of energy and costs quite a bit compared to just feeding in the field. The handling cost or the feed delivery is more expensive. The amount of bedding is required, and then because bedding is more, we have more bedding in the traditional system than in the swath grazing systems, then manure removal costs more. So what's the difference here between the swath grazed crops? Well, we know that the corn, and we'll talk about this later, corn costs about twice as much to grow as triticale or as barley. But we found that no matter when we plant barley, well, actually, when we plant barley in the middle of June, it's going to yield somewhere around 6,000 pounds per acre of dry matter, and that's going to give us somewhere around 250 cow days an acre, or about 600 cow days per hectare. So we can double that yield with any crop, and we did it with triticale. Then triticale costs a little bit more than barley to grow, but the cost per day, or cost per kilogram of dry matter, is going to be about half as much. So that feed can carry you about twice as far. If we look now at the cost of production from planting to harvest or storage, that's up until the time of swathing to compare all these crops. The cost of production of the conserved feeds on the left-hand side and the extended grazing crops on the right-hand side, for the most part, aren't that much different. For example, if you look at the hay price at $111 an acre, and the cost of swath grazed barley at $92 or swath grazed triticale at $121, yeah, there's a difference, but it's not that large. The difference is probably larger farm to farm. There are some exceptions, though, and that is when we harvest barley for silage or corn for silage, whatever we're going to do, and get it into the pit before we feed it, then it really increases the cost, almost doubles it. If we look at corn in particular, standing corn or swath corn or even silo corn, to get the crop into the silo is going to cost about twice as much as the small grains. So these crops that cost a lot have to yield more, have a higher carrying capacity or higher quality. And lots of times they do, sometimes they don't. On the other end of the spectrum, the cost per acre of stockpiled grass, or the second cut of a forage crop in a hay graze system, costs very little. And so if you're looking at a really low cost crop, we have to put it in the right place, but it may be your stockpiled grass in the right place at the right time. We want to look at components or inputs. Land is really important. Land, probably particularly in the irrigated area, is quite important. The amount of land that might be devoted to wintering cows. When the price of calves is not high and the price of grain is high, there is a trade-off between how you would use that land. And so there's really no reason why the traditional system, the feeding system, whether you use green feed, hay, or whatever, should take more land than it does for the, let's say, the triticale corn and barley or oat that you plant. But if you're using a lot of straw in the system, probably it's going to take more acres to get enough straw than it would, say, whole plant barley or whole plant triticale. The other end of the spectrum, as I said, quite low yields of stockpiled grass or second cut grass. If you were to devote the whole system of your farm to that, would take a considerable lot of acres. And we see within the swath grazed crops, at Lacombe anyway, triticale has some advantage there. The amount of labor that's required is significant, and labor is a really controversial topic these days, but labor is hard to find on farms to take care of cattle. And so the traditional system might take you 3 weeks of man days to get it from the crop and fed. Whereas these systems that use an electric wire to move cattle most of the time are going to take you less than a week. And so that's really important. It's, can you handle the cattle in the winter? Diesel fuel is another input that varies in cost, maybe not going to cost so much right now, but certainly did. And because we're not doing all of those extra activities of winter feeding, the traditional system can take as much as 4 to 5 times more fuel than those extended grazing practices. Again, the stockpiled system would take the least, but then it yields less than anything else. So usually when we talk about increasing yield to a cow guy, he says that's going to cost me some money. But why do we care about yield, even though it sounds expensive? So one of the things is that there's a relationship between yield and carrying capacity if we assume that the utilization of the crop is going to be constant or somewhere around 80%. So we see this relationship on the left-hand side, carrying capacity, and it's in cow days per hectare, but we'll extrapolate that into cow days per acre. And you see that there's a linear relationship, and this data didn't come from plots. This came from pastures where we were winter grazing cows from anywhere from 80 to 140 days during the winter, and most of this research was 4 to 5 years. And so the carrying capacity for the stockpiled grass was much lower. Now, I'm going to back up a step and tell you what we get on average from barley, which is the standard. Barley would average somewhere around 250 cow days an acre, 600 cow days per hectare. The stockpiled grass would give you 77 cow days of really cheap grazing, which shouldn't be discounted, but it's a lot less. Triticale, on the other hand, would give you double that. And so the relationship then becomes a matter of the daily cost for feeding a cow in the winter, which would be the relationship between carrying capacity and that cost. So you see, whereas the stockpiled grass on the left-hand side didn't cost very much, the carrying capacity was low, and it brought the cost per day up pretty close to where the barley and oats are. So there really wouldn't be a whole lot of difference, somewhere in that $1.05 to $1.15 a day. Corn costs about twice as much, but if you're in an area where corn yields well, and we had some talks about corn yield here, and if we can get somewhere in the order of 15 tons per hectare, then the carrying capacity of corn is high enough to bring the cost down even to the small grains. Triticale would be lower than that. So we talked about yield. What happens to forage quality in the winter? Am I going to tell you that forage quality is important, or does it make a difference? Before I finish, I've talked kind of in a, you may think I'm talking kind of critical of stockpiled grass, a little bit derogatory, but really I'm not. We have to, in this day and age, consider every feed we have possible and every piece of land we have on a farm to cut costs and to be efficient. So there's a place for everything. And it happens that stockpiled grass has pretty high quality, and it's a matter of placing that in the system, in the sequential system of winter feeding and summer grazing, so that we get the most out of it. So what about quality and swath grazing? So we've grazed swath grazed barley the most, but any swath grazed crop, we know that it takes more energy per day for a cow to survive and maintain her weight when she's out there foraging in snow and in swath compared to standing at a feed bunk, for example. So it's not unusual, because the winter weather conditions vary so much and snow conditions vary so much that cows lose weight. So we can accept that cows lose weight if we start them on pasture in good condition, so long as we keep their body weight up, and they're particularly vulnerable in their late stages of pregnancy. So if we look at, and these are a number of studies, they weren't in one study, but over several years in each of the examples that I'm showing you, If we compare the digestibility, which is represented by what we call in vitro true digestibility, or IVDT, and we rank them from low to high, we see that in this case, barley lost 73 pounds per winter per cow of a 1,500-pound cow. And at the other end of the scale, we have swath grazed corn, higher quality, just about 10 units higher. Stockpiled grass, one pretty much kept the weight of the cow consistent, and the stockpiled grass actually allowed a gain in weight for the cows. So a question that's often asked is, what happens with the forage quality in the winter? Well, it's almost impossible to keep the forage quality the same as it was when it was cut. So we have what we call weathering losses in the feed, losses that occur during winter, and the biggest losses occur after cutting and between snowfall. Once the snow is on the crop, we don't lose so much until spring. But it tends to be that those crops that are higher in quality early can maintain their quality high enough to reach the minimum, to attain the minimum requirements of the cow at any one time. So the triticale may not lose its quality as fast as corn during the winter, but corn will stay up. So those of you that are grazing standing corn or swath corn or whatever are probably in good shape. It's just more expensive. We did an experiment where we compared stockpiled grass grazing, the second cut of a meadow brome grass stand compared to swathed oats. And we got some results that surprised us. We saw that the digestibility of the grass was high, and the cell wall digestibility of the grass was high, and oats was low in both cases. We thought that the protein content of the grass would be high because it was green, but the protein content of the oat turned out to be higher. But as we showed you before, we lost weight when we swath grazed the oat, and we gained weight when we swath grazed the grass. Looking a little more detail at stockpiled grass or second cut grass quality over the winter, and in this study we used several different kinds of grasses and some legumes, but I'm just showing you the meadow brome grass and alfalfa. We know that when frost comes, alfalfa leaves go, and so their quality declines rather rapidly, particularly in October. The grasses tend to stay higher in quality, and grasses like meadow brome grass and creeping red fescue, if you can grow it, maintain high quality and are good to maintain cow weight as long as possible. But there gets to be a point during the winter, probably along about January or February, where we get a decline in quality and increase in fiber. Protein doesn't change much, but then it's probably better to use that stockpiled forage earlier rather than later. So finally, does crop management make any difference? You know, we've gone through all these studies where we've really struggled to make the case for extended grazing and just prove that it's feasible. But that's really not good enough. You get to the point in these crops where you have to say, does management mean anything? Because it certainly does in grain production, and you've seen that in the presentations here and in other agriculture crops, like what about varieties and so on and so forth. Well, things like planting date or managing planting date make a difference, because we know that in order to swath barley, for example, in September, it may have to be planted as early as the 1st of July in some cases. But the relationship between planting date and yield in barley is pretty negative, and you can see that by planting towards the end of June to get your barley crop swath, you may end up with a yield loss of about 40%. Crops like triticale and oats are less sensitive to this planting date decline, and it does affect your carrying capacity, which is in turn going to affect your cost. And your per acre cost isn't going to be much different when you plant it. So forage yield decreases, or be aware that forage yield may decrease as planting date is delayed. One of the questions that we had been asked a great deal before we got to work on triticale as a swath grazing crop was, in our grant proposals, they'd come back and the farmer boards would say, well, cows don't eat triticale, they just don't touch it. But we didn't quite believe that. And in the interim, at the Lacombe breeding program for spring triticale, we knew that there were reduced on types of triticale, which you see on your right compared to the left. And they were under development, and we've used those for the past few years. Varieties like Bunker, Tyndall, Teza, these types. We don't know necessarily that the on was the difference between them, but we just haven't had any problem grazing triticale and been able to take advantage of the yield. So this is a slide, like we use drones too, and we took a picture this fall because there wasn't a lot of snow there, comparing Bunker triticale and CDC Maverick barley. If you look at the Bunker triticale, and then our measurements tell us that we're probably utilizing about 85% or only losing about 15% of the Bunker triticale, and we are losing at this point anyway considerably more of the Maverick barley or another barley variety. So that work is not done yet, and it's kind of ongoing, but at least the triticale is doing well enough. So can corn be economical? We talked about the fact that I know that you can grow corn here. I've worked on corn for about 40 years now, and we talked about the fact that corn costs twice as much. So there is a risk there. Corn costs twice as much as a small grain to grow, depending how you grow it, of course, but can it be economical? And we have to say it depends, because corn is so sensitive to corn heat units, or the amount of heat unit accumulation that affects your whole plant yield, your silage yield, or your yield for swath grazing or grazing at standing. So we did some work on planting date, as I showed you for the small grains, and we showed you that information. And we're going to look here very quickly at 3 years of corn data and yield compared to the small grains, barley, triticale, and oats. And we had a year where we had below average corn heat units, above average corn heat units, and average corn heat units. And we had different yields on the corn, as you can see. So if we look at the corn in the black compared to the yield of the other three species, we see that in the cool year, the corn didn't yield any more than the other species in triticale at Lacombe, this is, and it won't be the case here, but triticale out-yielded the corn. So in the year with above average corn heat units, and this happens occasionally, and more than, it appears more than just occasionally, we'll have these years that are warm. And you see in that case, the black line from the corn out-yielded absolutely everything else. So in a year with about average corn heat units, or slightly above average corn heat units, what happens? Well, in this case, corn planted early with a hybrid that is adapted to the area, did out-yield everything except the Wapiti triticale. Now, we know that there's a difference in price and that the small grains cost about half as much, so we thought it would be interesting if we just used that data and compared it to, on an extrapolated costs basis, to carrying capacity. So when we looked at corn in the cool year, we found certainly the small grains were as efficient economically. In the year where we had lots of heat units, the corn was competitive as anything, and it gave you that added quality that you might be after in extended grazing. And then some of the treatments were the same or better than the corn in the year with average corn heat units, but the only one that was lower was the triticale. So as corn yield increases, so does carrying capacity, which helps to bring your cost per kilogram of feed produced down, which brings your cost of feed per day down. So corn yield varies with corn heat units, and if you're going to plant corn for that purpose, you have to accept that risk. So going back to conclude then, when we're really talking about systems on farms that have beef cows and how we can reduce those costs. So in the future, I think that we know that if we reduce that yardage cost, that we're automatically going to reduce the cost of calf production. But because of different weather patterns and different farms and different ways of doing things, We're not going to be going out and saying that one thing is better than another, but probably on the farm you're going to have to figure out what combination of all of these things work. And if we go by the requirement of the cow during the winter, we probably could put weight most easily on cows by stockpile grazing during the fall when the quality is high, then have cows in good shape going into winter on swath graze crops. And perhaps we have to increase the amount of bale grazing or using bales as winter conditions dictate, but perhaps that fits best when cows need more feed, and it's easier to control that later on during the winter towards spring. So in summary, yes, extended grazing reduces yardage costs, and just about anybody can reduce their cost if they can make their cows graze successfully outside in the winter rather than feeding them at a feed bunk. High yield equals high carrying capacity and should lower your cost, and so you have to strive for yield if you want to reduce the feed cost per day. High forage quality may reduce cow weight loss, and it should do that, but it's affected by how much you feed them in the first place using an electric wire. Weathering effects on quality is variable, but the time and the year you use the forage relative to the requirement of the cow is important, and the initial quality of the feed that you're feeding may be the most important. So in the future, agronomic management, or how well we can grow these crops for extended grazing, is going to be important. We're going to put more emphasis on that. And placing grazing methods in sequence, in other words, as we talked about, using all of those tools in the toolbox in the right place is probably going to be the most efficient method time after time to reduce risk and reduce cost at the same time. Thanks.